In that darkness lived a man named Park Jae-wha. He was not just a man, he was a king of the underworld, a leader of a powerful family that ruled with iron and silence. People trembled at the sound of his footsteps. He was cold, like the winter wind off the Han River, and his heart was a locked vault that no one had the key to. But then came Zola. She was a young woman from a small village in Nigeria, traveling far from home to find a better life. She became a maid in Jaewa's massive, lonely mansion. While others looked at the floor when he passed, Zola looked him in the eye. She saw the sadness he hid behind his expensive suits and sharp words. She didn't see a monster. She saw a man who had forgotten how to be human. Night after night, as she cleaned the cold marble floors, their paths crossed. A simple hello turned into long conversations in the library. He told her of his burdens, and she told him of the sun-kissed plains of her home. They were from two different worlds, two different races, and two different lives. But the heart does not care for rules. They fell in love in the quiet corners of a house built on secrets, never knowing that their love would soon become a storm that would tear everything apart. The secret romance between the Mafia king and the maid was like a flower growing in a crack of a stone wall, beautiful but fragile. Jaewa began to change. He smiled more, and the coldness in his eyes began to melt whenever Zola entered the room. But in his world, love is a weakness that enemies use like a blade. Jaewa knew his family council would never accept a woman like Zola, especially not one who wasn't of their blood or status. They began to meet in secret, sharing stolen moments of peace. However, the peace did not last. Zola soon discovered she was pregnant, not with one child, but with two. She was carrying twins. When she told Jaewa, he was filled with a joy he had never known, but that joy was quickly replaced by a terrible fear. He knew his enemies would kill the children to hurt him, or his own family would take them away to raise them as cold soldiers of the Mafia. "We must keep this a secret," he whispered to her one night, holding her close. But secrets have a way of escaping. Jaewa's right-hand man, a cruel man named Min-ho, had been watching them. He saw the way Jaewa looked at the maid. He saw the glow in Zola's eyes. He began to dig into her life, waiting for the perfect moment to strike. Zola felt the walls closing in. She realized that the golden cage she lived in was about to become a tomb for her unborn babies. She had to make a choice. Fear is a powerful teacher, and it taught Zola that she could not stay in Seoul. One rainy evening, she found a folder on Jaewa's desk. Inside were the results of a secret DNA test he had ordered to ensure the twins were safe from certain genetic markers. The paper proved they were his, blood of the Park dynasty. But next to it was a letter from the council demanding Jaewa marry a powerful heiress to strengthen the family. The letter stated that any distractions must be removed. Zola realized that distraction meant her and her children. Her heart shattered. She believed Jaewa was being forced to choose his empire over her life. She took the DNA test results and hid them deep in her bag. She didn't tell him goodbye. She knew if she saw his face, she would never be able to leave. With the help of an old friend at the docks, she managed to get onto a cargo ship. She had very little money and only the clothes on her back, but she had the strength of a mother. As the ship pulled away from the glittering lights of South Korea, she watched the city disappear into the mist. She cried for the man she loved, but she held her stomach and promised her babies a life of freedom. In Seoul, Jaewa returned home to find her room empty. He roared in pain, tearing the house apart, but Zola was gone like a ghost in the night. He didn't know she had his heirs. He only knew his soul was gone. 7 years passed. In a vibrant, dusty neighborhood in Lagos, Nigeria, 2 children played in the sun. They were beautiful, a perfect blend of their mother's deep mahogany skin and their father's sharp, intense features. Their names were Kofi and Amara. To the neighbors, they were just Zola's clever children, but Zola knew they were royalty in a world they had never seen. She worked 3 jobs to keep them fed and in school. She was a seamstress, a cook, and a cleaner. Every night she looked at the hidden DNA test, now yellowed with age, and remembered the man with the cold eyes who had loved her. She told the children their father was a brave warrior who lived far away across the sea. She never mentioned the word Mafia. She thought she was safe. She thought the ocean was wide enough to keep the shadows away. But Jawa had never stopped looking. For 7 years, he had turned the world upside down. He had become even more powerful, even more ruthless. But he was a king without heart. He had never married. He had never forgotten the black woman who had taught him how to feel. He spent millions on private investigators, tracking every lead from London to New York to Africa. He was a hunter who did not tire. Then, one day, a grainy photo landed on his desk. It was a picture of a woman in a Lagos market. Beside her were 2 children. Jawa's breath hitched. He didn't need a test to know. He saw his own eyes looking back at him from the faces of those children. The moment Jaihua saw the photo, the coldness that had frozen his heart for 7 years turned into a raging fire. He didn't call the police. He didn't call his ambassadors. He called his private army. "Prepare the jet," he commanded, his voice trembling with a mix of fury and hope. "We are going to Nigeria." He felt a deep sense of betrayal. Why had she fled? Why had she kept his children in poverty while he sat on a throne of gold? He believed she had stolen his blood, his legacy. He wanted answers, and he wanted his children. On the other side of the world, Zola felt a strange shiver down her spine. The air in Lagos felt heavy, as if a storm was coming, even though the sky was blue. She walked the children home from school, her eyes scanning the crowds. She had become paranoid over the years, always looking for a face that didn't belong. That evening, as she tucked Kofi and Amara into bed, she felt a sudden urge to move again. Maybe they should go to the village, she thought. Maybe they should disappear into the hills. But it was already too late. A black SUV with tinted windows had pulled into the dusty street 2 blocks away. Inside, men with earpieces and suppressed weapons waited for the signal. The hunter had found his prey, and he was not planning on leaving empty-handed. The peaceful life Zola had built was about to collide with the violent world she had tried so hard to escape. The night was thick with the sound of crickets and the distant beat of drums when the silence of Zola's street was broken, not by a bang, but by the soft, rhythmic thud of boots on dirt. Zola was in the kitchen, washing the last of the dinner plates, when she saw a shadow pass the window. It wasn't the shadow of a neighbor. It was too tall, too straight. Her heart leapt into her throat. She ran to the bedroom where the twins were sleeping. "Kofi, Amara, wake up," she hissed, her voice shaking. "We have to play the hide-and-seek game, now." The children, used to their mother's occasional midnight drills, scrambled under the heavy wooden floorboards where she had built a secret compartment years ago. Just as she slid the rug over the wood, her front door was kicked off its hinges. The wood splintered like glass. 3 men in tactical gear stepped into the small house. They were professionals, moving with a deadly grace. Zola stood in the middle of the room, clutching a kitchen knife. She looked like a lioness protecting her den. "Who are you?" she screamed. "Where are they?" a voice answered. It wasn't one of the soldiers. The men stepped aside, and a tall figure emerged from the dust and shadows. He was wearing a suit that cost more than the entire street. His hair was slicked back, and his eyes were like chips of flint. It was Jaihua. He looked around the humble room with a look of pure disdain and agonizing hurt. 7 years, Zola, he said, his voice a low growl. "You stole my children and brought them to live in this?" Zola dropped the knife. The clang of the metal on the floor sounded like a death bell. She couldn't breathe. The man she had dreamed of, the man she had loved and feared, was standing in her tiny living room. He looked older, harder, and more dangerous than she remembered. "Jaihua," she whispered, her voice cracking. "I didn't steal them. I saved them." Jaihua stepped toward her, his presence filling the small space until she felt she might suffocate. "Saved them? You kept them from their father. You kept them from their heritage." He grabbed her arm, not to hurt her, but because he was shaking with emotion. "Where are they, Zola? Don't make me burn this city down to find them." Tears streamed down Zola's face. "Your family would have killed them. You know the rules of the Park family. They would have never let a black Maid's children lead the dynasty. They would have been used or discarded." Jaihwa's grip tightened. I am the head of the family now. I make the rules. At that moment, a small sob came from beneath the floorboards. Amara couldn't hold her breath any longer. Jaihwa's eyes shifted to the rug. He pushed Zola aside and ripped the rug away. He saw the latch. With one pull, he opened the compartment. There, huddled together, were two terrified children. They looked up at the strange man with the sharp suit. Jaihwa froze. The anger left him for a second, replaced by a wave of recognition so strong it made him stumble. They were his. They were exactly like him. Kofi, being the older twin by 3 minutes, stood up and stepped in front of his sister. He had his father's defiant chin. "Don't hurt my mommy," he shouted, his small voice echoing in the room. Jaihwa stared at the boy. He saw the fire in his eyes, the same fire that had allowed Jaihwa to survive the underworld. He reached out a hand, but the boy flinched away. This hurt Jaihwa more than any bullet ever had. His own son saw him as a monster. "I'm not going to hurt her," he said, his voice surprisingly soft. He looked at Zola, who was now on her knees begging, "Please, Jaihwa, take me. Do whatever you want with me, but let them stay here. They are happy here. They don't know your world." Jaihwa looked at the peeling paint on the walls and the lack of electricity. Happy? They are parks. They belong in a palace, not a shack. He turned to his men. "Take them to the cars. Carefully. If a hair on their heads is harmed, you will all pray for death." The soldiers moved forward. Zola screamed and tried to grab Amara, but a guard held her back. The children were carried out, crying for their mother. Jaihwa stood over Zola, his face a mask of cold stone again. "You are coming too. You have a lot to explain. And don't think about running. There is nowhere on this earth I won't find you now." He hauled her up and led her out into the night, leaving the small house empty and broken, just like the life she had tried to build. The journey back to South Korea was a blur of luxury and terror for Zola. They were on a private jet, the kind she used to see flying high above the clouds in Legos. Kofi and Amara were tucked into leather seats, surrounded by toys and food they had never seen, but they wouldn't eat. They only wanted to sit by their mother. Jaihwa sat at the front of the plane, staring out the window. He didn't speak to them for the entire flight. His mind was a whirlwind of plans. He had to secure his borders. He knew that bringing back a black woman and 2 biracial children would cause a civil war within his organization, but he didn't care. He was the boss. When they landed in Seoul, they were whisked away in a convoy of armored cars to a fortress-like mansion in the mountains. This wasn't the house Zola remembered. This was a stronghold. As they entered the gates, Zola saw hundreds of men standing at attention. They all bowed as Jaihwa walked past. The children clung to Zola's skirt, their eyes wide with fear at the display of power. Jaihwa led them to a grand suite of rooms. "This is where you will stay," he told them. "You will have everything you need, teachers, doctors, clothes, but you do not leave these walls." Zola looked at him, her eyes filled with fire. "You've just traded one cage for another, Jaihwa. You think they will love you because you give them gold? They will only remember that you took them from their home." The first week in the mansion was a battle of wills. Jaihwa tried to win the children over with gifts. He bought them horses, the latest computers, and the finest silk clothes. But Kofi and Amara remained silent. They wouldn't call him father. They wouldn't even look at him. They spent all their time in the gardens with Zola, speaking in low voices about the sign in Nigeria. Meanwhile, the Mafia Council was in an uproar. News had leaked that the boss had brought back foreigners and claimed them as his heirs. One evening, the council members arrived at the mansion, demanding an audience. They were led by Elder Choi, a man who believed in blood purity and tradition. "Jaihwa," Choi said, his voice echoing in the grand hall. "You cannot do this. The Park family name is at stake. These children are not of our kind. They will never be accepted by the other families. You are weakening us." Jaihwa stood at the head of the table, his hand resting on the hilt of a decorative sword. "They are my blood," he said, his voice like cracking ice. "That makes them more our kind than any of you. If any man speaks against my children again, he will not live to see the sunrise." The threat was clear. But Zola, listening from the balcony above, knew that words wouldn't be enough. The council was plotting. She saw the way they looked at the mansion as they left. They didn't see children, they saw targets. She knew she had to find a way to make Jaywall realize that his power was the very thing putting them in danger. Zola decided she could no longer be a silent prisoner. One night, she waited until the children were asleep and walked into Jaywall's study. He was surrounded by maps and ledgers, looking exhausted. "Why did you really come for us?" she asked, her voice steady. Jaywall looked up, surprised by her boldness. "Because they are mine, Zola. A man does not abandon his legacy." Zola shook her head. "Is that all they are? A legacy? A trophy? You haven't asked them how they feel. You haven't asked me why I hid the DNA test." She reached into her pocket and pulled out the crumpled, yellowed paper. She threw it on his desk. "I found this 7 years ago, next to a letter saying distractions must be removed. Your own people were planning to kill me and the babies before they were even born. You were too busy being a boss to see the snakes in your own garden." Jaywall picked up the paper, his eyes scanning the DNA results, and then the memory of that old letter hit him. He had forgotten how much power Min-ho and the others had back then. "I would have protected you. You didn't give me the chance." Zola stepped closer, the moonlight hitting her face. "You couldn't protect yourself back then, Jaywall, and you can't protect us now, not as long as you are the king of shadows. The children need a father, not a general." For the first time, Jaywall looked unsure. He looked at the DNA test, the proof of their bond, and realized that his pride had blinded him to her sacrifice. While Jaywall and Zola struggled with their past, a new threat was rising. Min-ho, the man who had spied on them years ago, had grown powerful. He was now the secret leader of a faction that wanted to overthrow Jaywall. He saw the children as the perfect excuse. He began to whisper to the other families. "The boss has lost his mind. He brings a maid and her bastards to the throne. He is unfit." Min-ho knew he couldn't attack the mansion directly. It was too well guarded. He needed to lure them out. He orchestrated a fake peace summit with a rival triad, insisting that Jaywall bring his new family to show strength and unity. It was a classic trap. Jaywall, wanting to prove to the world that his children were untouchable, decided to go. Zola begged him not to. "It's a trap, Jaywall. I can feel it in the air." But Jaywall's ego was wounded. He wanted to march into the city and show everyone that he was the master of his own fate. "We will go with a full escort," he assured her. "Nothing will happen." He ordered the children to be dressed in miniature versions of his own formal suits. Kofi looked like a tiny prince, but his eyes were full of dread. Amara clung to her mother's hand as they boarded the armored limousine. As the convoy moved through the winding mountain roads towards Seoul, Zola noticed that the lead car was moving faster than usual, creating a gap. Her heart began to race. "Jaywall, something is wrong," she whispered. Suddenly, an explosion rocked the road. The lead car vanished in a ball of fire. The limousine slammed to a halt. "Ambush!" shouted the driver. Bullets began to rain down on the bulletproof glass like hailstones. Jaywall immediately pulled a weapon from under his seat and pushed Zola and the children to the floor. "Stay down!" he roared. Outside, men in black masks swarmed the convoy. It was a coordinated strike. Jaywall's loyal guards fought back, but they were outnumbered. Min-ho's plan was working. He didn't want to kill the children yet. He wanted to capture them to force Jaywall to surrender his empire. A rocket-propelled grenade hit the car behind them, and the force of the blast flipped the limousine onto its side. Zola felt the world spin. When she opened her eyes, smoke filled the cabin. She heard the children coughing. Jaywall was kicking at the jammed door, his face covered in blood from a forehead wound. "Zola, take the children and run into the woods," he yelled, finally forcing the door open. "I'll hold them off." Zola grabbed Kofi and Amara, pulling them through the wreckage. They scrambled into the thick forest that lined the road. Behind them, she heard the deafening sound of gunfire and Jaywall's voice calling out commands. She didn't look back. She ran until her lungs burned, her only thought being the survival of the 2 lives she had stolen away 7 years ago. In the darkness of the forest, Zola and the twins hid in a shallow cave beneath a fallen tree. The sounds of the battle on the road began to fade, replaced by the terrifying sound of men searching the brush. "They went this way," a voice shouted in Korean. Zola covered the children's mouths with her hands. She could hear her own heart thumping against her ribs. She realized then that no matter where they went, Nigeria or Korea, the shadow of the Mafia would always find them. She looked at Kofi and Amara. They were trembling, their expensive suits torn and stained with dirt. This was the heritage Jaehwa wanted for them: death and fear. After several hours, the forest went silent. Zola decided to move. She knew she couldn't go back to the road. She had to find a way to the city, to someone she could trust. But who? She was a stranger in a land that hated her. Suddenly, a flashlight beam cut through the trees. Zola froze. A figure approached. It was one of Jaehwa's men, a young guard named Ken, who had always been kind to the children. He was wounded, clutching his side. "Ma'am," he whispered, "the boss, he's been taken. Minho has him. They're searching for you. You must come with me." Zola didn't know if she could trust him, but she had no choice. She took the children's hands and followed Ken through the shadows, praying that she wasn't walking into another trap. Ken led them to a safe house, a small, nondescript apartment in the crowded outskirts of Seoul. It was the opposite of the mansion. It was cramped and smelled of old cooking oil, but it was hidden. "Why are you helping us?" Zola asked as Ken bandaged his wound. "The boss saved my family once," Ken said simply. "He is a hard man, but he is fair. Minho is a monster. If he finds the children, he will use them to take over everything and then discard them." Zola sat on the floor, holding her children. She felt a strange mix of emotions. She was angry at Jaehwa for bringing them here, but she was also terrified for him. She realized that despite everything, she still loved him. She didn't want him to die in a dark room at the hands of a traitor. "Where is he?" she asked. "Minho took him to the old shipyard. He wants Jaehwa to sign over the family seals. Once he has them, he won't need any of you anymore." Zola looked at the DNA test results she still had in her pocket. She thought about the 7 years she spent in Lagos, thinking she was alone. She realized she wasn't a victim anymore. She was the mother of the Park heirs, and she was the only one who could save their father. "Ken," she said, her voice turning cold and sharp, "do you have weapons, and do you know how to get into that shipyard?" Ken looked at her, surprised by the fire in the black woman's eyes. "Yes," he said, "but it's suicide." "No," Zola replied, "it's justice." Zola spent the next few hours planning. She knew she couldn't leave the children alone, so she made Ken promise to stay with them while she went to find a way to contact the one person who might help, Elder Choi. She knew Choi hated her, but he also hated disorder and traitors. She left the safe house disguised in a heavy coat and a headscarf, moving through the rain-slicked streets of Seoul. She managed to find a payphone and called a number she had memorized from Jaehwa's study. When Choi's assistant answered, she said, "Tell the elder that the mother of the Park twins has the DNA test and the proof of Minho's treason. If he wants to save the family name, he will meet me in 10 minutes at the Gyeongbokgung gate." To her surprise, a black sedan pulled up 10 minutes later. Choi sat inside. "You have a lot of nerve," Choi said. Zola didn't flinch. "Minho is destroying your purity, Elder. He is using foreign mercenaries to kill your boss. Is that the tradition you want to protect, or do you want to help me put the rightful king back on the throne so your family survives?" She showed him the DNA results. "These children are the future. Whether you like my skin or not, they are the only ones with Park Jae-la's blood. If Minho wins, the Park line ends today." Choi looked at the paper, then at Zola. He saw a strength in her that he had never seen in the socialites of Seoul. "What do you need?" he asked. With Choi's secret support, Zola gained access to a small group of loyalists who had refused to follow Minho. They provided her with a tactical vest and a radio. She wouldn't be the one shooting, but she would be the one leading them to the shipyard through the secret tunnels she had learned about years ago when she was Maid. The shipyard was a graveyard of rusted metal and deep shadows. Inside a central warehouse, Jae-wa was tied to a chair. His face was a mask of bruises, but his spirit was unbroken. Minho stood over him, holding a pen and a legal document. "Sign it, Jae-wa. Sign the empire over, and maybe I'll let the woman and the brats live." Jae-wha spat blood at him. "You've already lost, Minho. You just don't know it yet." Suddenly, the lights in the warehouse flickered and died. A voice echoed through the rafters, a woman's voice, strong and unwavering. "He won't be signing anything today, Minho." Zola stepped into the glow of a single emergency light, flanked by Choi's men. Minho laughed. "The maid? You came to save him? How touching!" But his laugh died when he saw the red laser dots of snipers appearing on his chest. Zola walked forward, her heart pounding but her hand steady. "I hid my children for 7 years to keep them from people like you," she said. "You think I'll let you take their father now?" The warehouse erupted into chaos. Gunfire flashed in the dark. Zola dove behind a shipping crate as Choi's loyalists moved in. She wasn't a soldier, but she was a woman who had survived the streets of Lagos and the halls of a Mafia mansion. She moved with purpose toward the center of the room. She saw Minho trying to use Jae-wha as a human shield. "Stay back!" Minho screamed, his eyes wide with panic. Jae-wha, seeing his chance, threw his weight backward, knocking both of them to the ground. Zola ran forward, grabbing a heavy metal pipe from the floor. As Minho reached for his gun, Zola swung with all her might. The pipe connected with Minho's arm with a sickening crack. He howled in pain. Before he could recover, Jae-wha had freed one hand and delivered a knockout blow to the traitor's jaw. Silence fell over the warehouse as the remaining mercenaries surrendered to Choi's men. Zola stood over the 2 men, gasping for air. Jae-wha looked up at her, his eyes filled with a mixture of shock and profound gratitude. "Zola," he whispered. She knelt beside him, quickly untying the ropes. "Don't you ever," she sobbed, "ever make me do that again." He pulled her into a hug, his blood staining her vest. In that moment, the power dynamics had shifted forever. The king had been saved by the woman he had tried to cage. The aftermath of the battle was swift. Minho and his conspirators were handed over to the internal justice of the Mafia, a fate worse than prison. Elder Choi, seeing the bravery of Zola and the undeniable loyalty she had for the family, made a surprising announcement. He declared that the children were indeed the rightful heirs, and that Zola would be treated as the lady of the house. They returned to the mansion, but it felt different now. The walls didn't feel like a cage. They felt like a shield. Jae-wha spent weeks recovering from his injuries. During that time, he did something he had never done. He played with his children. He sat on the floor with Kofi and learned how to play the games they liked. He let Amara braid his hair, much to the shock of his guards. He began to see that strength wasn't just about fear. It was about what you were willing to die for. One afternoon, he called Zola into the garden. "I am stepping down," he said quietly. Zola looked at him in disbelief. "What? But you just won." "I won the war, but I'm losing my soul," Jae-wha said. "I've appointed a regency council to run the business side until Kofi and Amara are of age. I want to take you home, Zola. Not to a mansion, but to a place where we can just be a family." "Where would we go?" Zola asked, her heart fluttering with hope. Jae-wha smiled, a real smile that reached his eyes. "You told me about the sun in Nigeria. I want to see it. I want to build a school there. I want our children to know both their worlds, but without the blood." Zola felt a weight lift off her shoulders that she had been carrying for nearly a decade. But the transition wasn't easy. There were still those in the Mafia who didn't want them to leave. A few days before their planned departure, a small group of dissenters tried to block the gates. They claimed the bloodline shouldn't leave Korean soil. Zola didn't wait for Jae-wha to handle it. She walked down to the gates herself, carrying the DNA test result and a picture of her children. She spoke to the men in their own language, which she had been studying in secret. "You worry about blood," she said to the guards, "but blood only pumps the heart. It's the soul that makes a man. These children carry the soul of the Park family and the soul of my people. If you stop them from seeing the world, you are making them weak, not strong." The men, moved by her passion and her fearlessness, stepped aside. They bowed not to a boss, but to a mother. Jae-wha watched from the balcony, realizing that Zola was the strongest person he had ever known.
The day they arrived back in Lagos was a day of celebration. Zola's old neighbors gathered around the large, beautiful house Jaehwa had bought on the outskirts of the city. They were shocked to see the warrior father Zola had talked about. Jaehwa was no longer in a sharp suit. He wore light linen and a look of peace. Kofi and Amara ran through the yard, showing their father the trees they used to climb and the markets where they used to play. For the first time, the children called him Papa. The word brought tears to Jaehwa's eyes. He spent his days working with local architects to build a state-of-the-art school and a community center. He used his Mafia skills to navigate the local bureaucracy, but he did it with a new purpose. He wasn't building an empire of shadows, he was building a legacy of light. Zola became the director of the center, helping women who had traveled far from home, just like she once did. They were finally happy. But deep down, Zola knew that the world they left behind would one day come calling for the twins. They were still the heirs to the Park dynasty. She made sure they studied their Korean history alongside their African heritage. She wanted them to be ready for whatever the future held. As the twins grew into teenagers, they were a force to be reckoned with. Kofi was a brilliant strategist with his father's sharp mind for business. Amara was a natural leader with her mother's empathy and fire. They were famous in Lagos and whispered about in Seoul. One day, a black car arrived at their gates in Nigeria. A young man stepped out. It was Ken, the guard who had helped them years ago. He was now an elder in the park organization. He had come with a message. "The Regency Council is failing," Ken said, sitting in their living room. "The other families are moving in. They need the park heirs to return and claim the throne, or the family will be wiped out." Jaehwa looked at Zola. The moment they had feared had arrived. Kofi and Amara, now 16, stood together. "We should go," Kofi said, "not to be mafia bosses, but to change the organization into something legitimate. We can use the resources to do what we're doing here, but on a global scale." Zola felt a pang of fear, but she also felt immense pride. Her children weren't running away from the shadows. They were going to light them up. "We go together," Zola said, "as a family." The return to Seoul was unlike their first arrival. There were no convoys, no secret jets. They arrived on a commercial flight, walking through the airport like any other family. But the news spread like wildfire. The lost heirs had returned. They held a meeting at the Grand Mansion, inviting all the heads of the major families. Kofi and Amara stood at the front of the room. They didn't wear suits. They wore traditional Nigerian attire made of fine Korean silk, a symbol of their dual identity. "We are not here to rule an underworld," Amara announced, her voice echoing with authority. "We are here to lead the Park Corporation into the future. We are divesting from all illegal activities. Those who want to follow us into a legitimate, powerful future are welcome. Those who don't, well, you remember what our father was capable of." Jaehwa stood behind them, his presence enough to remind everyone of the power they were dealing with. The transition was rocky, and there were many who resisted, but the twins were unstoppable. With Zola's wisdom and Jaehwa's reputation, they began to transform the Mafia into a global powerhouse of technology and philanthropy. The Black Maid, who had once scrubbed the floors, was now the matriarch of a new kind of empire. Years later, a statue was built in the center of the park headquarters in Seoul. It wasn't a statue of a warrior or a king. It was a statue of a woman holding two children looking out toward the horizon. It was a tribute to Zola. Jaehwa and Zola, now gray-haired but still deeply in love, sat on a bench near the statue. They watched their grandchildren playing in the plaza. The world had changed. The rules of blood and race that had once threatened to kill them were now just stories from a dark past. "You were right, Zola," Jaehwa said, taking her hand. "I thought I was hunting you down to save my children, but you were the one who saved me." Zola leaned her head on his shoulder. "We saved each other, Jaehwa. That's what families do." They looked at the DNA test results one last time, now framed in the lobby of the building, not as a secret, but as a testament to the truth that love has no borders and a mother's courage can change the destiny of a nation. They had turned a story of crime and shadow into a legend of hope and unity. So, my children, remember this tale when you think the world is too cold or the shadows are too deep. Remember the black maid who dared to love a king and the mafia boss who chose his heart over his crown. Remember that the greatest power in the world is not the gun or the gold, but the truth of who we are. Zola and Jaywah's story is told in the markets of Lagos and the high-rises of Seoul. It is a story of how a hidden DNA test didn't just prove a bloodline, it proved that we are all capable of becoming something better. The twins, Kofi and Amara, continue to lead, proving every day that beauty is found in the blend of our cultures. And as for Zola, she still looks at the moon every night and thanks the stars for the day she decided to run and the day she decided to stop running. The shadows are gone now, replaced by the warm amber glow of a family that refused to be broken. Sleep now, and dream of a world where love is the only law we follow. For, in the end, we are all just travelers looking for a place where we can truly be home.